As someone who facilitates dialogue and cares a lot about dialogue, I often get asked, aren't there some topics that are simply beyond dialogue? Some topics where there's just an incontrovertible right and wrong, true and untrue, and even engaging the dialogue is giving life and breath to something that's ridiculous. For example, would you have a dialogue with somebody who said the world is flat? Or would you have a dialogue with somebody who said, actually, the moon landing in 1969 was a deep fake? Let's make it more relevant to today, although frankly, there are people who say both of those things. But would you have a dialogue with someone who continued to say the 2020 election was stolen? Or somebody who said, I actually do not believe gender-affirming care should be provided for trans people. Today, I want to take on this really hard question of whether there are limits to the kinds of topics we should dialogue on. And to do this, I want to provide 3 questions for your consideration when deciding whether you want to engage in a dialogue around a tough issue with another person. I want to start at the beginning because I actually think the question about whether there are some topics that are worth putting outside the domain of dialogue or conversation is really not the right question to ask. And I think the reason why here is because, for me at least, whether I would engage on a conversation, whether it's about the legitimacy of the 2020 election, or about the truth of climate change, or about whether or not the earth is flat or round, actually depends a lot more on both the person with whom I'd be having the conversation and the context in which that comes up. So from my perspective, I would be willing to have an actual dialogue on any topic with a person depending on the answer to these 3 really important questions. Question number 1 would be, what is the purpose of the conversation? That is to say, do I think that entering in this conversation, I may have anything to learn from this other person? Part of the answer, of course, depends on my own ability to move from a stance of certainty into a stance of curiosity. So, for example, if somebody is saying, I do not believe the Holocaust happened, or I believe the earth is flat, it would be really hard for me to have a serious conversation with them if I could move myself to say, listen, my purpose isn't even to persuade them. I just need to understand how they came to this viewpoint. Then there may be some value to the conversation here. Now, I know some people will say, just having that conversation, even in a learning way, legitimizes their viewpoint. And how could you legitimize something like the earth is flat or something like the Holocaust never happened? And that's where the purpose comes in, right? My purpose is not to legitimize. I'm not doing this on a YouTube video. I'm not doing this in a newscast. I'm not doing this in a public forum. I'm doing this one-on-one for a very explicit purpose, which is to learn and understand. So question number 1, what is my purpose? Question number 2 is also important. Is the person with whom I'm having this conversation someone I otherwise respect or care about or value in some way? That is to say, do I think that this is somebody who I'm in relationship with? I don't think they're totally crazy. I think they try to think about things rationally. They have an important place in my life. And therefore, as hard as this conversation might be, as trying, as confusing, as maybe exasperating, there's a reason for me to move forward, because not having the conversation is somehow blocking what could be a better and more authentic relationship. The third question I would ask is, quite apart from their beliefs, do I think that this person can enter into this conversation from a place of good faith and integrity. So that does not mean that they have to be open to persuasion, but it does mean that at the very least they can engage in some listening and aren't simply there to be a naysayer, to fold their arms, to shake their head. If they're not a partner in the conversation, then it's not a conversation. And so part of my consideration here, before I began this conversation, I would probably say something about how hard this is for me, how much I'd like to enter into the conversation, but I'd also ask them, is this something you're willing to do? Is this something you're capable of doing in a good faith, open, and generous way? And if they said yes to that, then I'd be more inclined to actually have this conversation. I've actually had the opportunity to make this really hard decision with someone who is very close to me around the 2020 election. Now, I know that even some of the people watching this video probably have pretty strong views on this. I'm just going to be really clear about my view, because pretty much every single court and many people in the Trump administration, including the person monitoring elections, including the vice president at the time, including the Attorney General of the United States, all said without a scintilla of a doubt that the 2020 election was not stolen. In fact, Joe Biden won fair and square. That is something that is at the very basis of this democracy for me. And yet, I had a very close person in my life who actually believed that it was stolen. And I actually decided to engage a hard conversation. And my purposes were really to try to understand where this person was coming from. Also, it was somebody I cared about and respected, and I believe they could enter into good faith. And I believe they could enter the conversation in good faith. I have to be honest with you, it was not a fun conversation. It was a very frustrating conversation. But I learned something in that conversation, right? And one of the things that I learned was truly how misinformed this person was, right? That every time I shared some data that was really research-based data, they would respond with an anecdote. And then when I kind of tried to listen to that and ask an open-ended question, when they would feel stuck, they would change the topic. And so every time I thought they were in the conversation in absolute good faith. But at the end of the day, right, what I came away thinking was, this was not a situation that was movable. They were not trying to be manipulative. On the other hand, they just had really bad sources of information that they were putting their trust in. So, truth of the matter is, I'm glad I had the conversation. My purpose wasn't to persuade. I didn't succeed if it was. My purpose was to learn. I do feel like I honored the relationship by going into this, and at no time during the conversation did I think that they were operating in bad faith. So this is an incredibly hard topic. I'm imagining, if you're still watching, that some of you are probably in agreement with me that it's really important to have these difficult conversations, and some of you are thinking, you know, Bob, maybe you're going a step too far. Like maybe there are topics that you really shouldn't engage a difficult conversation on, simply because you legitimate something that shouldn't really have any legitimacy. For me, that's the wrong question to ask. The questions that I ask are, what is the purpose of this conversation in the first place? Do I have anything to learn here? Secondly, is the person with whom I might have this conversation someone I respect and care about, someone I need or value? And third, apart from this domain that we have a gulf of misunderstanding, do I otherwise think they operate in good faith? And if I answer those questions yes, I think I might well choose to have that really hard conversation. I'm not going to do it in public forum. You're not going to see it here on YouTube, because I may not want to legitimate the idea that the world might be flat or that the United States never landed astronauts on the moon. But for my purposes, it might be worth doing. So if you've enjoyed this video, or if it's gotten you thinking in any way, keep watching this next one, which is how to mediate a conflict between two employees. And if you're still here watching, I'd be incredibly grateful if you would subscribe to my channel, like this video, and ring the bell so you never miss new content. Okay, it's not too difficult for me to ask you to keep watching. Click, click, click.